This evening, we continue our study in the book of Hebrews. We are in chapter 11, and we're going to be beginning down in verse 8. Hebrews chapter 11, beginning in verse 8. In the first 7 verses of this chapter, we saw faith explained, the confidence of things hoped for, and the conviction of things not seen. We saw within that context faith exemplified. We talked about the worshiping faith of Abel, the walking faith of Enoch, and the working faith of Noah. In that, we find that faith is emphasized. And without faith, it is impossible to please God. And we must believe that He exists and reward those who diligently seek Him. Another aspect of our faith pertains to the promise in which we have hope. We're warned in chapter 4 not to fall short of that promise, that it is there for us if we are faithful. In chapter 6, it talks about faith along with patience is necessary to inherit the promise that's been given to us by our Lord Jesus. Tonight I want us to talk about the faith which pleases God, that one that embraces God's promise. And as we look at Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 22, we learn that faith in those who embrace the promise, and that because they embrace the promise, that God is not ashamed of them, and He is not ashamed to be called their God. We have to look at ourselves. Do we have that kind of faith that makes God unashamed to be called our God? That's what we're going to look about this evening. We're beginning this study in the faith of the patriarchs, the faith of Abraham. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8 it says, by faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. You know, if you go back over and read this occurrence, God called him to leave his country, his family, everything that he knew behind. And he was to obey the voice of the Lord. And he did not know where he was going. He didn't know about this promised land. He didn't know what was there. That's the things that are unseen. It's here where we learned that faith and obedience are not contradictory terms. Going back to Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 9, it says, and having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation. And then on over in Luke chapter 6, verses 45 and 46, it says, the good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth what is good. And the evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth what is evil. For his mouth speaks from that which fills his heart. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? Obedient faith is the thing that we must adhere to. We must be diligent in that. And that's a key word here within the context of Hebrews. And that's what Abraham did. He lived by faith. He lived as an alien or a sojourner in a land that he did not know anything about. Going back to Hebrews chapter 11, dropping down to verse 9. It says, by faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. And he looked for a city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Now, this was a foreign land, and it was a land that was populated. This was not an empty place of land, but there was people that were living there. And he went there as an alien. He wasn't part of those people. He and his family that had left Ur of Chaldees, they had went in there and they were bringing their flocks along. And they were becoming a part of that land. Now, this was the land that was promised to them. The land that the children of Israel received after leaving Egypt. His descendants would not have this land for 400 years. And you go back to Genesis 13 and Genesis 15 and read about all of these things that happened. The key factor here is that he was looking for a city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. He's looking for a holy city. Through his obedience, he was looking for that after a while. This suggests that the promise he embraces was more than just pertaining to the land of Canaan. It was confirmed by that heavenly abode. And our faith also requires us to live in a foreign land. We too are aliens and strangers, or sojourners and pilgrims. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 1 it says, "Beloved, I urge you as alien and strangers to abstain from fleshly lust, which wage war against your soul." And we talked a little bit about this morning when we talked about our life. Our walk in this world is so short. But we're just alien and sinners, alien and strangers here. And sinners too sometimes. But the thing about it is we've got a better place. And it is that city that's made without hands. That city that's on the foundation. It is that which we sojourn toward. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 14 it says, "For here we do not have a lasting city, but we are seeking a city which is to come." And that city that he's talking about within Hebrews is that new heavens and that new earth. That's what we're looking for. It's not something that's physical, but it's that which is spirit. Well, Abraham, he was asked to do a very, I don't know what word I would use, a very unique thing. And that was offer up Isaac. Think about it. He left Ur of Chaldees. He went into what we know of today as, can't even think of it now. Over there where all the Jews are today. But he was also asked to offer up his son Isaac. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17, it says, "By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, 'In Isaac your descendants shall be called.' He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type." Now, you can go over to Genesis 22, 1 through 19, and read of this occurrence. That took a lot of faith, folks. Can you just fathom in your own mind that God comes along and says, "You have to sacrifice your son or daughter for me"? And the promise was that Isaac was going to be the father of all these descendants that would end up into the promised land. The promise was in him from God. Now, he assumed that God would raise Isaac from the dead if need be, but he kept his promise. Those are the things hoped for. Our faith often requires us to forsake that which is closest to us. Sometimes our loved ones, our family, even our own life. Luke chapter 14, beginning in verse 26, notes that reality. Our faith needs to be like Abraham's faith. And yes, even if we have to sacrifice that most precious, we would be willing. And then it talks here in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 11, the faith of Sarah. And by faith, she received strength to conceive a child. It says by faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore there was born even of one man, and him as good as dead at that, as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. Sarah was well beyond the age of childbearing. Though she kind of laughed at God at first, but God promised. And she judged him faithful because of that promise. It was through her faith the promise of a great nation was fulfilled. And again, they were up in age, well beyond the years of having children. Our faith requires also looking to God for strength and God to fulfill his promises. Again, to go back and restudy this, Genesis 18 and Genesis 21 talks about this occurrence. Our faith requires us to look to God for strength and trusting that he will provide it. Sometimes God's answer is not exactly what we desire, but it's what we need. In Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 16, it says, "Therefore let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." Like Sarah, we should have a receiving faith, because God is there to take care of us. He's there to be with us when we have that time of need. But we also need to understand it's by his will, and it's in his time. In verse 20, it talks about the faith of Isaac. And it says, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, even regarding things to come. And you can find that in Genesis 27, verses 1 through 40. And this illustrates how Isaac, by faith, embraced the promise. No matter what happened, he embraced the promise of God, went forward, looked forward. We see the same faith in Jacob. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 21. It says, by faith Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshiped, leaning on the top of his staff. He blessed the sons of Joseph while he was dying. He knew there was a future. And you know, we think about the promise of God today. God has promised the Christian, the faithful, a heavenly city, a city with foundations that's built upon Christ Jesus. It's built without hands. It's at heavenly abode. And we need to continually look forward to that blessing, even though we do not know when Jesus will come. And here's the thing when we go back to Abraham and we think about that. Abraham went to the promised land. He didn't receive it. 400 years later, the children of Israel received it. We may leave this world before we receive our promised land, but we have to be prepared to receive it when Jesus comes back. That's a key factor in all of this that he's talking about here. We also see in verse 22 the faith of Joseph. It says, by faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel and gave orders concerning his bones. He talked about what had happened, and he was dying. And he gave those instructions about what to do with his bones, and they did that. We find that over in Genesis chapter 50, verses 24 through 26. Such was the faith of the patriarchs. Now we skipped verses 13 through 16. For what is said there not only applies to Abraham and Sarah, but to Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and also to ourselves. And remember, Hebrews is trying to encourage these Jewish people to be faithful, not to turn back to Judaism. And he's bringing to light that their faith can be that which is pleasing to God, and they are to embrace the promise that's given to us as Christians. And that's that eternity in heaven, that blessed place that we're all looking forward to. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 13, it says, all these died in faith. That's a key factor. They died faithful to God without receiving the promise. We may die without receiving the promise that's given to all who are faithful, the Christians today. But having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth, for those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And that's what we're looking for. That country, that city made without hands. Verse 15. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have opportunity to return. You know, Abraham could have went back to Ur of Chaldees, but he didn't, because he had faith in the promise. And that's what the Hebrew writer is trying to tell these people and us. Don't go back where you came from. Keep moving forward, because the promise is there. But we are not restricted in going back. We just have to reap the consequences of our choices. Verse 16. But as it is, they desired a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. They did not receive the promise during their lifetime. Yet, with faith, they could see it afar off. And you know, I have faith, and I can see heaven, and I can see the passages in Revelation that talk about the new heavens and the new earth and how beautiful heaven is going to be. I can see that even though I may make that transition before I get there or before Jesus comes back, but I know it's there. And I understand that we are strangers and we're pilgrims here in this world. And that implies that we are seeking something more. But what they desired was a better one. Indeed, a heavenly country. And that's what we too are looking for. They died in faith, being faithful, with the hope that the promise is there. Hope, earnest expectation is what that is defined. I have an earnest expectation that if I am faithful to God in my walk of life, that I'll have that promise. I'll be in that heavenly abode. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for him. He's not ashamed of those people because they were faithful. I would suggest that God's not too happy with those who are unfaithful. Now remember, the writer is writing to Christians. And if a Christian turns his back on God, if a Christian leaves Jesus, I would suggest that God's not too pleased with that reality. And we might even say that he would be ashamed of them. Does that negate the blessing that they can return? We talked about that just a moment. They could return to Christ, and then he would not be ashamed. The key factor in this section of chapter 11 is faithfulness. Faithfulness because the promise is there. And can you just imagine how many years ago that these individuals died, but yet they were faithful to God? And you know, we see in the New Testament where people were coming up and they were saying, well, we are struggling because Jesus hasn't returned yet. And that was in the first century. And here we are, 2025. Jesus hasn't returned yet, but he will. I have faith in that. I can see that. And when he comes back, for the faithful, the doors of heaven will be open. The doors are prepared for us. Those mansions, they're ready when God sends Jesus back. If we are faithful, he is not ashamed to be called our God. These people that is being enumerated in this context, he was well pleased with them. And it was their faith embracing the promise that pleased him. And he prepared that city for them. It's what they're waiting for. What we're waiting for. It's there. It's at new heavens and new earth, 2 Peter 3. It's at New Jerusalem, the great city that descends out of heaven, Revelation 21. And indeed, even now in a sense, we have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God and the heavenly Jerusalem. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 22 through 24. We must query ourselves about our faith, our faithfulness. Does my faith Does my faithfulness please God? Do I have a worshiping faith like Abel? Do I have a walking faith like Enoch? Do I have a working faith like Noah? Or do I have a waiting faith like the patriarchs, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph? The faith that pleases God is that one that embraces the promise. And I don't know how to be more powerful than this embrace. It denotes the idea of grabbing a hold and holding on for nothing can get you off. Nothing can get you away. Patiently waiting for the ultimate fulfillment, even if it doesn't happen in our own lifetime. But with conviction and confidence, we have those things hoped for and those things unseen. And we have to be those people that obey His calling. While we sojourn in this earth, while we're just strangers here, He will offer up whatever He asks of us. And we receive strength that we might endure. We might make that diligent, hold on, to grasp what's there, to embrace it. And He's going to give us that strength to do so. And we will receive that promise. This is the kind of faith that saves the soul. This is the kind of faith that God is not ashamed to be called their God. May God bless us. Grant us that grace and mercy that we need, that we may strive diligently to develop the same kind of faith that these people had as we look forward to the promise of that city made without hands. If you're not a child of God here tonight, we encourage you to put on your Lord and Savior in baptism, to be raised up to walk in the newness of life. If there is other needs on your heart that we can help you with, please allow us to do so. Come now, as together we stand and as we sing.